everyone, this is Veronica with Sew It Seams, and welcome back. Today in our Dear Jane quilt, we are going to be working on block I-7, which is also called Mac and Muff. This block looks like it might be a pretty simple block to work on. When I'm looking at it, I'm seeing that we have 4 of these half square triangles, and then they're just pieced together with little strips of our colored fabric and then bordered around with the background and then applique 4 little triangles. So I think this block is going to be pretty straightforward. It'll just be a matter of getting the right sizes cut. I've chosen as my main focus fabric for today this purple fabric, which is really pretty, but I am working with just scrap pieces. I don't have a larger piece. I think there will be enough, but I'm hoping that there will be and I won't run out. And then, as always for my quilt, my background fabric is going to be my muslin. Our first step is going to be working on the half square triangles. Out of both my foundation fabric and out of my focus fabric, I'm cutting 2 squares at 2 1/4 inches. This is going to create all 4 of those triangles. Now, usually on some of these blocks with this kind of method, I've just cut the diagonal on each of the squares. Today I'm going to do a little bit of a different method. On the back of my lighter fabric, which for me is my background, I've drawn my diagonal line, but then I've also drawn my stitching line for each of these. So I'm going to place my foundation and my focus fabric right sides together. Then I'll just pin it in place so it doesn't shift. And then I'll stitch my seam on each of these outer lines. The reason I'm doing that is that it will reduce the tendency for the fabric being cut on the bias to stretch out of shape. So this is just another method of being able to sew this. So I'm going to go ahead and sew these 2 seams on both of these little square units. My stitching lines are complete. So now just cut right down that center diagonal. And then I will press this open so that my seams are pressed toward the darker fabric. These squares may be just a little big, so you'll want to square them up to 1 3/4 inch. Now that my half square triangles are finished, I'm going to lay them out in the order that they need to be in the block. So for this particular layout, the focus fabric is on the outer part of these little half square triangles. So we have our muslin on the inside. The first step that we'll do is sew little strips of my focus fabric to connect 2 of the blocks. So here are my strips, and the strips need to be cut at 1 3/4 wide by 1 inch. So let's go ahead and sew these together. Now that these 2 strips are sewn together, we can get our center strip sewn in there. And that will again be out of the focus fabric. Mine is cut at 3 1/2 by 1 inch wide. Now, one thing I will say is go ahead and measure the length of your pieces here and cut your strip to that length. You may have a slight variation in your length. It might be a little bit shorter, it might be a little bit longer. It just really depends on just your stitching of your seams. So the best thing to do would be to just measure and make this strip the length that it is of your pieces that you've sewn together. In the long run, when we do the border around, we can make that border a little bit wider as needed so that the whole entire block will be the right size. So right now I am going to sew these 3 together, and I'll have this very center part of this block done. The seams are all sewn and pressed, and now I have a cute little 3.5 inch center unit. One tip to keep in mind when piecing the side pieces to this strip, try to match up these side strips as closely as you can. You can see I'm just a little off here. It's just my seams were a little bit larger here than they were here. In the long run, it's not going to notice, but just try to keep them as even as you can straight across. Now, before we continue on with piecing the last part of this block, I just wanted to talk about the borders. When you look at Jane's borders, you can see she has this small strip here on either side. We have a strip, and then we have longer strips on the outer border. I am not sure what Brenda was doing in her rendering of this. She's got one long strip and one short strip, but here she just made them all different sizes. So we're not going to do that. We're going to do 2 short strips and then 2 longer strips. My strips for the border are cut, and my long strips I've cut at about 5¼ inches long and 1½ inches wide, and my shorter strips are cut at 3½ inches long and 1½ inches wide. They are a little bit bigger than what I'm going to need for the border, but that gives me just a little bit of leeway for being able to trim the block down. Now I'm going to sew these border strips on first before I work on the applique parts, because the applique is going to need to line up to my center block. So let's get these borders sewn on. Now our block is effectively done. I've got the borders sewn on, and you can see that the borders don't quite match up, but that's okay because it's extra space. When I put my ruler over the block, you can see I've got plenty of room for trimming it when I square up my block. Now let's work on the last part of this block, which is the little triangles around each side. So I've cut my template. These are very tiny little triangles, but they are basically going to go right on the side here, and we're going to cut those out of our focus fabric. Now, because they are tiny, we're going to try to not have too much of a seam allowance of our fabric around the edge, because that'll start to get bulky and difficult to sew on. These tiny applique pieces are a bear to do. I don't know what Jane was thinking, but she had all the time in the world to work on these, I guess. What I'm going to do is just work one side at a time. So I've got one side, I've finger pressed it under and I've pinned it down. The edges of my triangle that I've drawn on here line up with the edge of the strip. So I'm going to just start at one corner and just stitch this down. I've stitched across and I've stitched right into that corner of the triangle. Now I'm going to work on folding it under to work on this seam. So I folded it under, and I've got a bit here that wants to poke out. What I did is I folded it under so I can get that crease, but now I'm going to poke that triangle right at that corner there under, and now I'm going to fold the triangle part. Oops, it wants to get away from me. I'm going to fold that down, and it's a little fiddly to fold. I don't want to keep trying to hold it down. My fear is if it keeps popping up and I let go of it, that I'll start to fray the seams. So I'm just going to pin that down now, and I'm going to use my needle to make sure that I keep pushing that part of the triangle corner underneath so it doesn't show. And once again, I'm going to sew right to that end point of my triangle. Now I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the other one. Now I've got both of these points are sewn down. So what I'm going to do is push under each corner. I'm not pushing it under the triangle, I'm just kind of folding it back under the seam. So now you can see I've got that there, and then I will push under the whole thing. And my finger can't do it completely, so this is where I'm going to get my needle and just kind of push that under. My thumb is holding it down. It's hard to see because my thumb is over this very tiny little piece, but I'm pushing it down under. So now my triangle is down, and I'm going to get this last seam sewn. Now when you look very closely at mine, you can see just a smidge of the pencil line from drawing on my triangle. But if someone is going to be getting up this close to look at my block and say, hey, you've got pencil lines, well, then I don't know what I would do. I would say you need to back up. Maybe I'll give them little snips and they can snip little threads, because I always forget little threads in my quilts. I'll put them to work. And there we have one minuscule little triangle sewn onto the block. Now I'm going to do the same process in the next 3 sections. And that block is now complete. I've gotten all 4 of the triangles sewn on, and I've trimmed up the block so that it is the correct size. This block was actually pretty easy to put together. The hardest part on that were the tiny, tiny little triangles. But other than that, this block went together really well. So I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough of making block I-7, also called Mac and Muff, from the Dear Jane quilt. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below or send me an email at soitseemscreations@outlook.com. If you like this video, you can go ahead and click that thumbs up to like the video. You can also subscribe to my channel and click that notification bell to be notified when I upload a video, which is generally every Monday. This is Veronica Johnson with Sew It Seems, and I'll see you next time.